Okay, so you're at the podcast, and this is a huge one. We're definitely going to talk Plotinus and the Enneads. But I do have some interesting developments I wanted to share with you guys. First of all, I got this book in the mail. I ordered it for my kids, part of the homeschooling routine. This book was published in 1921 by, what's his name there? Hendrik Willem van Loon. You can get it for like 26 bucks. You want this edition. This is the school edition. It's the most anti-woke book I've ever read. And this was the standard. There are great illustrations. It's basically a history of everything that ever happened for like 6th graders. So if you have children, what an opportunity I've just shared with you. Get on it. The next thing is a few follow-ups from the last episode on Antigone. An episode I'm proud of, but which had a few flaws that were my mistake. I was in a rush or something. First, in my desperate attempt to find a larger audience, I pandered with the clickbaity Meghan Markle title, just to make up connections, basically. To clarify, I don't think that Meghan Markle is like Jesus or Antigone, is not a martyr who opposes a corrupt institution. For all its flaws, I think the British Crown does not seem anywhere near as perverse as the Pharisee-mediated Roman Imperium or as bad as Creon's autocracy. But for what it's worth, I still do see parallels between Jesus and Antigone. Both were given a chance to recant and fall in line and obey the established authorities, and both chose to die instead for a higher law. And needless to say, Jesus was actually real, whereas Antigone was a fiction. Second note, I mentioned the part near the end of the middle of the play in the Oedipus cycle of Sophocles, the play called Oedipus at Colonus, and the lines where a dying Oedipus says to his children who've gathered around him, quote, "Children, this day your father is gone from you, all that was mine is gone. You shall no longer bear the burden of taking care of me. I know it was hard, children, and yet one word frees us of all the weight and pain of life. That word is love." So that's the English translation. Well, it turns out that I assumed the love there was the same one from 1 Corinthians 13:13, where it's like love is patient, love is kind. Agape love. As a matter of fact, the word used by Oedipus was philia, which is a more interpersonal or relational kind of love, sort of like brotherly love. And to make matters worse, I think I said in the episode caritas when I should have said agape, but even if I had said agape, I would have been wrong. I don't want to say too much more about all this, but it is interesting to think about which of those 4 loves, the 4th being eros, I think, right, that C.S. Lewis wrote about, is best understood as being the linchpin for civilization, at least according to Sophocles and the Greeks around 400 BC. Anyway, let's get to Plotinus. Wow, I had so much fun writing this up. So it's going to be a full episode of heavy content. You'll have to watch it twice. Or you'll get to watch it twice, basically. Look at this book. I mean, this is a doorstop of a book, right? 204 AD to 270 AD. Plotinus lived and worked in Hellenic Roman Egypt. He was taught by Platonist teacher Ammonius Saccas. Porphyry's preface to the Enneads, which is included in my edition, is the source for most of the biographical details. According to Wikipedia, which I know I shouldn't do much, and I promise to do better than this for this channel most of the time, but it is hard to summarize a life sometimes. And in this case, it doesn't even really matter, as I'll try to point out in a minute. But Plotinus took up the study of philosophy at the age of 27, around the year 232, and traveled to Alexandria to study. There he was dissatisfied with every teacher he encountered until an acquaintance suggested he listen to the ideas of Ammonius Saccas. Upon hearing Ammonius lecture, he declared to his friend, "This was the man I was looking for," and began to study intently under his new instructor. After spending the next 11 years in Alexandria, he then decided at the age of around 38 to investigate the philosophical teachings of the Persian philosophers and the Indian philosophers. I guess like in his postdoc. But really, enough about his biography. Let's try to understand something of his thinking. The Enneads is his main, and as far as I know, his only surviving work. And there's some intricate explanation for how Porphyry grouped them and what Enneads means in Greek. But basically, it's a collection of essays. I mean, again, look at this fatty. This is a nice book. You can get it for 12 bucks. I mean, hello. I've read it all once, and most of it twice, and some of it 3 or 4 times. And that means I've just barely begun to skim the surface of understanding Plotinus. But as always, what you're getting on this channel is a direct and otherwise unmediated reading by me, rather than by Leo Strauss, of the classic text, albeit in translation. So what have I gleaned from spending time with this text? Well, let me note first that the reason I picked up a copy of this book for the first time about 15 years ago back in grad school was because I was writing a seminar paper on Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson cites Plotinus at the beginning of his best-known essay, Nature. It was unusual at the time to cite Plotinus, early 19th century. He was better known among the medievals, although not by name, interestingly. Like, Plotinus had been kind of forgotten, although his influence is what I mean here, was sort of remembered best by. They were sort of semi-Neoplatonists, let's say, the medievals. And so my entry point for all of that was Emersonian transcendentalism, you know, with my meager background in Plato, which at the time included like one reading of the Republic and one of the Gorgias and maybe the Apology. I mentioned Plato here because Plotinus was basically a Platonist, and then like later was defined as a Neoplatonist by 19th century scholars when that whole line of thought again sort of became interesting, really following the work of people like Emerson, who made the mysteries of soul and mind more interesting again after the Enlightenment. Okay, so also one other interesting note here. I'm using the Stephen McKenna translation. He's an interesting figure. I just can't not mention him just in half a paragraph here. Basically, he gave his life to this translation of Plotinus. Himself an Irish nationalist and a friend of the great E.R. Dodds, McKenna basically spent 20 years translating this because it's not a simple text. In fact, it kind of requires, apparently, an interpretive translation to give the sense of Plotinus. And the reason the translation fell to him was because insider academics didn't feel courageous enough to take on such a huge project. It's a little bit like Edwardian in style, early 20th century, but you get used to that, and you begin to see through to exactly the sense of Plotinus that McKenna tried to communicate. So bravo to that guy for giving his life to this translation. Okay, the preface from Porphyry, which is included in this book, notes that the Enneads are broken into 6 main sections, and he describes them about like this. First, the first Ennead has an ethical tendency. The second contains disquisitions on the world and what belongs to the world. The third Ennead discusses the philosophical implications of the second Ennead, that is, the stuff regarding the world. The fourth Ennead deals with the soul, which, by the way, has to be carefully defined when you're talking about Plotinus. And the fifth Ennead examines what Plotinus calls the intellectual principle. I'll try to define that a little bit in a minute. The sixth Ennead is ostensibly a summation of all of this and primarily focuses on the idea of the one. Speaking of E.R. Dodds, I'm following his thinking about Plotinus here when I say that it's important to understand what is called the 3 principles of Plotinus. And these are the one, the intellect, and the all-soul. Dodds says these categories can sort of be found in Plato, but may have been transmitted to Plotinus by way of a guy named Numenius. Again, I hate this kind of 10,000-foot summary flyover of a really complicated set of ideas, but my video wouldn't be complete if I didn't give you at least a vague idea of these 3 principles. So very quickly, and then I'll handle some of the specifics of the text. But first, so I said the one, and this is the it certainly does connect to like Heraclitus and Parmenides talking about the one, or sometimes Socrates in the Parmenides dialogue and elsewhere. The one takes on an even more specialized meaning in Plotinus. This is sort of like the first name or hypostasis of the supreme divine triad. Envisaged logically, it is the one. Understood morally, it is the good. In other uses, it might be the simple, or the absolute, or the transcendence, the infinite, the unconditioned, and sometimes even the Father. It goes by many names, you understand. The one transcends everything material and is ultimately unknowable. It's even beyond what we call the creator, or the first cause, like Aristotle's first cause. Extremely, extremely ineffable. You have to think like above what we usually mean when we think of God, which is, for some of us, like borderline impossible. But I'm not Plotinus. This guy maybe had a bigger brain, and he certainly is, consistent on that point. All right, that's the first part of the triad. The second is the second part is called the intellectual principle. Usually, this seems to have been the part of thought that aims to know God. But it's so profound that you probably haven't even done it, or rather, you haven't noticed it, as it operates sort of behind the basic mind that gets you through material concerns day after day. Maybe it approximates the nous, the Greek word N-O-U-S, or spirit, or soul, something like that. If you think of like a guardian angel who's kind of steering you, or at least kind of vaguely protecting you, the like ego self, that's basically what the intellectual principle is. And the third element here is called the all-soul. And it is basically the eternal version of the intellectual principle, of the second part, right? So basically it's like a disembodied and impersonal version of soul. Okay, well, what's more interesting about these three things, that they are often said to form a unity. So in a very abstract and abstruse way, we have in Plotinus a divine Trinitarianism. Maybe more on that in a minute, because he is living in a time, he certainly has heard of Christianity. He doesn't deal with it much directly, but we sort of suppose that he's working on a synthesis here of like early Christianity and Platonism in ways that are super, super interesting. But okay, that's enough of me trying to summarize the whole thing. This is the kind of stuff you can hear on any Wikipedia page or YouTube channel. Or, of course, you can probably hear Leo Strauss lecture about it. What I want to do is to take a few bites of the text itself and try to pass on to you my own interpretation, tentative, of what some parts of Plotinus are all about. The first part I want to deal with is from the first Ennead, and it concerns the way the soul sort of steers a person toward the good, or toward God, or toward the divine, okay? What I want you to listen for here, in addition to the content, which is about the soul steering the person toward God, but in addition to that, I want you to listen to how Plotinus writes, which is he sort of thinks a dialogue within himself. I think in earlier podcasts I've referred to this as negative capability. It's the idea that you can kind of hold two divergent ideas within yourself at the same time, and it's like, I think that was Keats maybe talking about it in those terms, and certainly like Shakespeare, Bakhtin, Dostoevsky. This is a common idea, but like in Plotinus we certainly see it. It sort of takes I guess Plato did this, but Plato ostensibly heard Socrates debating with some other guy who disagreed with him. Plotinus does it all within himself, and this is a pretty cool intellectual development. I was actually out on a walk this morning and thinking about this, because you know how we if you actually start moving your lips and talking to yourself as you're alone, you're out there walking, like people think that's kind of borderline, like, are you unstable or something? But this is definitely how Plotinus writes, and I want you to pick up on that while I'm reading you some of this stuff. In this section I'm about to read, he questions himself and tries to answer himself. So this is from Ennead 1, I think it's the second tractate, the 5th section, if you're interested. And also note that one of the terms we encounter here, and there are a lot of them in Plotinus, the term he's going to use here is proficient with a capital P. And he uses it here as he does throughout the Enneads to indicate something like a guru or a master, right? Like, so it's one who kind of has achieved something philosophically, okay? All right, quote. The soul itself will be inviolately free and will be working to set the irrational part of the nature above all attack. Or if that may not be, then at least to preserve it from violent assault, so that any wound it takes may be slight and be healed at once by virtue of the soul's presence. Just as a man living next door to a proficient would profit by the neighborhood, either in becoming wise and good himself, or for sheer shame, never venturing any act which the nobler mind would disapprove. Continuing, there will be no battling in the soul. The mere intervention of reason is enough. The lower nature will stand in such awe of reason that for any slightest movement it has made it will grieve and censure its own weakness in not having kept low and still in the presence of its Lord. Wow. Okay, end quote at the beginning here. So this is truly fascinating stuff. If you caught any of it, you might have to rewind. I mean, seriously. Read Romans 7 to go along with this, too. You've probably heard me talk about that sometimes. Basically, he's suggesting something most easily explained by recalling Freud's id and superego stuff. Essentially, you, with your name and native language and material concerns, are kind of like a total moron. But, fortunately, you are being guided by a guardian angel called Soul, or Reason, who keeps you from getting in too much trouble. Okay, so now listen to where he goes with this idea next. I'm going to keep reading, same page here, okay? Quote, in all this, there is no sin. The only matter of discipline. Sorry, I got to start that over. I wrecked it. In all this, there is no sin. There is only matter of discipline. But our concern is not merely to be sinless, but to be God. That's amazing. As long as there is any such involuntary action, the nature is twofold, God and demigod, or rather God in association with a nature of a lower power. When all the involuntary is suppressed, there is God unmingled, a divine being of those that follow upon the first. I mean, whoa. Okay, he's talking about the way that you have the guardian angel and you have these involuntary impulses to do low things, basically. But he says, in all of this, there is no sin. There is only matter of discipline. That is to say, like, basically, the you who acts out and eats too much and has a hard time with Lent or whatever, that's matter. I love that. Matter that should be disciplined. But our concern is to be not just sinless, but to be God. We're becoming divine. Amazing. And so, like, whenever this tension is happening, you have God and then, like, demigod, or God and, mortal or something. And what we're trying to do here is to, like, purge mortal, let go of mortal, and become divine. Plotinus says our concern is not merely to be sinless, but to be God. And yes, that's as flabbergasting as it sounds. Merger with the one is always the goal in Plotinus. And this is why he had such a huge influence on Christian and even Jewish mysticism in the 1,000 years that followed, even if his name sort of got forgotten here. So what we think of as sin, Plotinus processes as something like undisciplined matter. It's basically like unsuppressed, involuntary action. You can think of Romans 7 here again. But when the involuntary action becomes suppressed by the soul, then there is God. If I have time, I will squeeze in that clip of Tom Cruise talking Scientology here, where he's talking about, have you ever met an unsuppressed person or whatever? Because it's almost the opposite of what Plotinus is saying. Like a suppressed person is the one coming closer to God, right? Like don't express yourself. Yourself is a degenerate, Edgar Allan Poe perverse thing, right? What you want is the guardian angel to sort of suppress your low instincts, okay? Okay, good. Keep reading or listening with me. Same page, we're still going here, same idea. Quote, for at this height, the man is the very being that came from the Supreme, the primal excellence restored. The essential man is there. Entering this sphere, he has associated himself with a lower phase of his nature, but even this he will lead up into likeness with his highest self, as far as it is capable, so that, if possible, it shall never be inclined to, and at the least never adopt, any course displeasing to its overlord. Hope you can follow this. Hopefully reading along on the screen and even pausing it on a second watch-through helps. Might have to slow this down from 1.25x, which is usually ideal for this podcast, to 1x, or like 0.75x if you're dumb. The point he's making is that there is something in us that is trying to refine us and to make our material embodied self like God. He continues, same page, quote, what form, then, does each virtue take in one so lofty? And then he answers his own question. Wisdom and understanding consist in the contemplation of all that exists in the intellectual principle, and the intellectual principle itself apprehends this all, not by contemplation, but as an immediate presence. Wow. Well, I mean, some of you here will hear the strange forebodings of Jonathan Edwards there, but maybe that's not quite right. I mean, there is an immediate revelation here, sort of like Edwards was talking about, but the revelation comes directly not to the ego self, but to the guardian angel, the intellectual principle, the soul itself. Keep reading, keep listening now, same page. And each of these has two modes according as it exists in the intellectual principle and in the soul. In the soul, it is virtue. In the supreme, not virtue. Wow. The supreme, by the way, is the one, okay, or the Father. So this is so difficult to understand this, let alone to try to explain it. But as far as I understand him here, he's saying that there's this phenomenon of contemplating what is in the intellectual principle. Again, kind of contemplating your guardian angel or your soul. And that phenomenon can be understood as a virtue when it is at work in the soul. But it's not a virtue from the perspective of the Supreme, of like God itself or God himself. Because then it's just like an operation of nature or something. You know, we don't say it's a virtue for the squirrel to gather the nuts and bury them in the fall or whatever. So then, listen, he continues, same page, questioning himself. He says, quote, in the Supreme then, what is it? Meaning, if not a virtue. Answer, its proper act and its essence. That act, this is quoting still, that act and essence of the Supreme manifested in a new form constitute the virtue of this sphere. For the ideal form of justice or of any other virtue is not itself a virtue, so to speak, an exemplar, the source of what in the soul becomes virtue. For virtue is dependent, seated in something not itself. The ideal form is self-standing, independent. I mean, honestly, okay, end quote. The largeness of the ideas here just swamps me sometimes. But I still think you're better trying to read this yourself than letting me or Leo Strauss read it for you. What I find is that after a while, this strange terminology, let me grab my water here. This strange terminology becomes more and more intuitive. And as you acquire his vocabulary, the ideas themselves start to make sense. And the ideas are seriously profound. In Plotinus, we find this incredibly perceptive grasp of what we might call, like the ruffians we are, the unsophisticated barbarians we are, merely psychology. But for Plotinus, psychology includes the will, the sin impulse, the soul, which preserves one from the sin impulse, the suppressive mechanism, and the supreme itself. There's an entire, esoteric geography of the mind happening here that makes our modern grasp on it feel totally pathetic to me. And keep in mind, by the way, this first example I took from about 12 pages into the first Ennead. So that's how dense this book is going to get. I mean, that's how complicated it gets by the 12th page. But for real, it all doesn't feel, masturbatory or condescendingly, unnecessarily overcomplicated. Plotinus isn't showing off. He actually sees all of these things inside human psychology. Take a breath. I have time for one other example here, and I'm tempted to pull from an excerpt in the 6th Ennead, since I know everybody is interested in the 1, but it's honestly too esoteric to cover in limited time. It would involve too much definition doing to get to it. Maybe if I read it again and kind of get up for it, I'll try a whole episode on the 6th Ennead later on if people want that. But instead, let's aim more modestly at understanding what capital B beauty has to do with the movement toward the good or towards God. This is from late in the first Ennead, the, I think, 6th tractate called Of Beauty. All right? Beauty, by the way, as I've said before, is one of these words that it still operates, it still works in the way it's supposed to on people. I mean, it's clinging for dear life, because if you Google beauty, you just get a bunch of Cosmopolitan magazine airbrushed covers of women. That's not what he means, of course. He means like transcendent beauty of the kind that the Cathedral of Notre Dame is a mere imitation, right? Okay, here's the quote to start us off here. Woo! Get ready, buddy. I want you taking notes. Schizo Rick. Ready? Quote. Therefore, we must ascend again towards the good, the desired of every soul. Anyone that has seen this, look at your screen, note the capital T there. Anyone that has seen this knows what I intend when I say that it is beautiful. Even the desire of it is to be considered as a good. To attain it is for those that will take the upward path, who will set all their forces towards it, who will divest themselves of all that we have put on in our descent. So, to those that approach the holy celebrations of the mysteries, there are appointed purifications and the laying aside of the garments worn before, and the entry in nakedness, until, passing on the upward way, all that is other than the God, each in the solitude of himself shall behold that solitary dwelling existence, the apart, the unmingled, the pure, that from which all things depend, for which all look and live and act and know, the source of life and of intellection and being. Bruh, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, Schizo Rick, Late Empire, Franz, Bernard, David, Brian G, Peep, Doc Asclepius, Quid, Tom, Paul Talk, and whoever else I'm neglecting as a true disciple here. Go back and read that again and again. I mean, I know you guys will appreciate this because And Rick, by the way, in particular, you read the E.R. Dodd's book. I mean, you understand about the mysteries here. You've heard me talk about Peter Kingsley. That's where we're going here. Big mysticism. But like these people he's referring to here were really doing some wild stuff. Not just eating the wafer, and then going to brunch afterwards. I'm talking the upward path, the transcendental way, the leaving behind of the body and its material concerns, which were the stuff of the way of the descent, okay? Which is, of course, the way that most people are following in life. Now listen, I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs here for the sake of time and attention, but I'm going to continue reading basically from this section on the next page. Plotinus then says, quote, "But what must we do? How lies the path? How come to vision of the inaccessible beauty, dwelling as if in consecrated precincts apart from the common ways where all may see, even the profane?" Yes! Right? Yes! I mean, how do we get it? How do we get it? How do we get this revelation of the great God itself? Here, Plotinus gives a nice little analogy, pulled from the Iliad. And so I can't resist reading the next little bit. But it's dense. He says, quote, "He that has strength, let him arise and withdraw into himself, foregoing all that is known by the eyes, turning away forever from the material beauty that once made his joy. When he perceives those shapes of grace that show in body, let him not pursue." Always be avoiding. Quote, "He must know them for copies, vestiges, shadows, and hasten away towards that they tell of. For if anyone follow what is like a beautiful shape playing over water, is there not a myth telling in symbol of such a dupe, how he sank into the depths of the current and was swept away to nothingness?" Pausing. I mean, here he refers to Narcissus, of course, but that's interesting, right? He's saying that, like, to become concerned with, physical forms, your Renault failure accounts and so on, it's narcissism. And you're going to fall into the water and be drowned and lose yourself. Wow. Continuing, quote, "So too, one that is held by material beauty and will not break free shall be precipitated, not in body, but in soul, down to the dark depths loathed of the intellectual being, where, blind even in the lower world, he shall have commerce only with shadows, there as here." Guys, you have to resist the flesh if you want the big revelation. Come on, listen! Obey the law, the real law of God. You understand? That's what Plotinus is saying here. He continues, quoting the Iliad this time, quote, "Let us flee then to the beloved fatherland, for this is the soundest counsel. But what is this flight? How are we to gain the open sea? For Odysseus is surely a parable to us when he commands the flight from the sorceries of Circe or Calypso, not content to linger for all the pleasure offered to his eyes and all the delight of sense filling his days." Okay, quote, end quote. I mean, I'm almost finished here. Basically, everything has been wind up for this part I'm about to read to you here. It's a question and then a 2-paragraph answer. You're welcome to print this out and hang it on your wall. Are you ready? I'm going fast here, too, because time. Quote, so he says first, "But how are you to see into a virtuous soul and know its loveliness?" So that's the starter question. Quote, "Withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there. He makes this line lighter, this other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten all that is crooked, bring light to all that is overcast. Labor to make all one glow of beauty and never cease chiseling your statue." Continuing, "When you know that you have become this perfect work, when you are self-gathered in the purity of your being, nothing now remaining that can shatter that inner unity, nothing from without clinging to the authentic man, when you find yourself wholly true to your essential nature, wholly that only veritable light which is not measured by space, not narrowed to any circumscribed form, nor again diffused as a thing void of term, but ever unmeasurable as something greater than all measure and more than all quantity. When you perceive that you have grown to this, you are now become very vision. Now, call up all your confidence. Strike forward yet a step. You need a guide no longer. Strain and see." End quote. I won't say too much about this, but I will say that paragraph makes my heart flex like Macho Man Randy Savage. I mean, my people are the ones who love that paragraph and who strive after it and who won't quit until they discover the thing it calls them to discover. You know what I mean? Behind the words. It's like for those who want to touch the wound. I want to see God's face, or at least see his foot upon the treadle of the loom. The point with Plotinus, and I think it's reasonable to say this after doing a full 40-minute lecture as concisely as possible, and feeling like I've not even scratched the surface. In fact, I feel like I probably did worse than if I said nothing at all, because I gave you the idea that he had just another little old idea that can be summarized. But no, that's not the point. No, this man will not be summarized. If you want to read the whole Enneads, good, but make sure to see through to the thing itself, the ultimate, the supreme. You have to become the proficient, my men. Okay, enough with the encouragement. You'll either get into Plotinus or you won't. Fine. I will make one final point here, because I know it's of interest to my viewers. Plotinus hardly touched politics, and he says almost nothing about Christianity, other than a sort of odd critique of Gnosticism. He died in 270 AD, so basically during the peak, the zenith of the persecution of Christians. So I don't know. It's hard to tell if maybe he was too afraid to embrace it, Christianity, as an open member of the church, but maybe he kind of secretly believed it. But it seems very likely he would at least have given it a look, especially because the reference to the Gnostics essentially was a reference to Christianity at this time, given that this was before all the heavy heresy hunting stuff that would start to take place after Constantine, for the most part. See, we are thrown into the world, and from birth we begin forgetting who we are, Hence the Platonic idea of anamnesis, of remembering the forms. And yeah, look, I get it. There absolutely are political concerns. And power is as important as anything in material existence, you might argue. But when you really see what Plotinus is saying, and by the way, when you see it, you also begin to see that that's what Plato was saying too. When you see it, you sort of lose a taste for politics. It makes a lot of sense what Plato says about how we'll need to force the philosopher kings back down into the cave, because they won't want to deal with such material, mundane concerns. Well, that's politics. But from the perspective of Plotinus, right? I mean, it's stuff you do in the cave. It's shadows on the wall. So, whatever. Personally, I do care about politics, especially in the last couple years. It's all become very interesting. But on days when I feel like politically defeated, like a man who at least has no power to influence big politics, to have Plotinus in my pocket to take refuge in, chef's kiss. It's like winning on a more important level. That's about it for this episode. High energy, heavy duty content. You really should listen to it twice. You should order this book and try it yourself. You won't be sort of disappointed at all. And if you have kids or are trying to start civilization over again, get this one too. Thank you for listening. Share this with your friends. Leave a comment. Like this video and upload it to the international database archive so that it doesn't get erased or whatever, so that it lives forever. And then and last point, we do have the secret stream for patrons only tomorrow night. We're going to be talking about the pyramids, Göbekli Tepe. There's that one in the Philippines that seems to be 12,000 years old. So let's talk about it. And, if anybody knows things about that I don't, I would be grateful to hear what you have to say. And we can talk basically about like deep, ancient, super ancient history, about Atlantis, about the Timaeus dialogue, and so on. What a great episode, huh? See you next time on the Godward Podcast.